He's one of the longest ruling leaders in the entire world, a man whose face you see everywhere in Iran, but whose story is just full of contradictions, of violence, and these incredible twists of fate. You know, to really understand modern Iran, you have to understand the man who has shaped it for more than 30 years, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And his story, well, it doesn't really begin with his birth. It begins with him nearly dying.
So let's start there. Not at the beginning of his life, but at the one moment that almost ended it. A moment that would really harden his resolve and, believe it or not, pave the way for his rise to power.
Okay, so picture this. It's Tehran, June 27, 1981. We're at the Abu Zar Mosque. The Iranian Revolution is still brand new, and honestly, it's chaotic. A cleric who's starting to make a name for himself, a guy named Ali Khamenei, shows up to give a speech. The air is thick, full of promise, but also full of danger.
So Khamenei starts speaking, and this man, who looks like a journalist, walks up and puts a tape recorder on the podium, supposedly to record the speech. But here's the thing. He wasn't a journalist, he was part of the Furqan group, a militant faction that was assassinating its rivals. And that was not a tape recorder.
The thing just erupts, a huge blast of fire and shrapnel. Khamenei is thrown backwards, his body is just shattered. The explosion destroys the nerves in his right arm, leaving it paralyzed for the rest of his life. It also hits his vocal cords, which is why his voice sounds the way it does today. He survives, but just barely, and he is forever a changed man.
So that's the real question, isn't it? How did this cleric, nearly blown to pieces in the chaos of the revolution, not only survive, but climb to the absolute, unquestioned pinnacle of power in Iran? Well, to get that answer, we've got to go back to the beginning.
Khamenei's entire journey to power was really forged by three things: his family, his faith, and the wild political landscape of a country that was just about to explode.
He was born in Mashdad, a holy city in Iran. His father was a well-respected Shia cleric, but they were poor. He was also an Iranian Azeri, which is Iran's largest ethnic minority. His childhood, as he tells it, was very simple, very austere, and totally dominated by religious study. This path took him from Mashdad to other holy cities like Najaf in Iraq and Qom in Iran. And it was this upbringing that really baked a deep, unshakable devotion to Shia Islam into his very core.
Now, the Iran that Khamenei grew up in was a total powder keg. See, it wasn't a theocracy back then. It was ruled by the Shah, who was very secular and pro-Western. The Shah was pushing for all these modern reforms, but at the same time, his brutal secret police, the Savak, were crushing anyone who disagreed. And in 1963, his White Revolution, which was meant to modernize things like land ownership, was seen as a direct attack on the power of the religious clerics. And that was the spark that was going to light the fire.
And right in the middle of all this tension, Khamenei finds his guide, his mentor. In 1957, in the city of Qom, he starts studying under this incredibly charismatic and fiercely anti-Shah cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This one relationship, it would become the single most important one of his entire life. It's what turned him from just a religious scholar into a dedicated, hardened revolutionary. So when the Shah exiles Khomeini in 1964, Khomeini doesn't leave. No, he stays behind, becoming this key organizer for the opposition inside Iran. And he paid a huge price for it. He was arrested over and over again by the Savak, thrown in prison for months, even tortured. And during this time, he was also hardening his own ideology, even translating the works of a radical Egyptian Islamist named Sayyid Qutb, whose ideas would later influence groups like Al-Qaeda. So, the 1979 revolution finally happens. The Shah is overthrown, but what comes next is just this violent, bloody power struggle. Khamenei's path to the top wasn't some brilliantly planned-out strategy. It was just a series of completely improbable events, a path paved by absolute chaos. And that year, 1981, was a pressure cooker of violence that would forge a new leader right from the brink of death. I mean, just look at this timeline from 1981. It is pure chaos. In June, the first president gets impeached. 5 days later, Khamenei barely survives that bombing we talked about. Then, just 2 months after that, the second president gets assassinated. The new regime was literally eating its own leaders. And out of all that carnage, who emerges as a candidate for stability? The recovering Ali Khamenei. And he gets elected Iran's third president. It was an absolutely stunning rise, right from his hospital bed. Fast forward 8 years to 1989, and the revolution faces its biggest crisis yet. Ayatollah Khomeini dies. The man who was the anchor, the symbol of the entire revolution, was gone. and there was no obvious successor. The regime was terrified that any sign of weakness, any infighting, could be fatal. They had to move, and they had to move fast.
And the result of that vote was a total shocker, 60-14 in favor of Ali Khamenei. Now, his selection was absolutely remarkable because, frankly, most people saw him as not religiously qualified enough for the job. His studies had been cut short by all his revolutionary work. But in that moment, the regime chose political stability and loyalty over a religious resume, and that one decision would shape Iran's path for decades to come.
Okay, so becoming supreme leader is one thing, but staying supreme leader for over 3 decades? That's a whole other ballgame. And Khamenei, well, he very quickly wrote his own playbook for grabbing and holding on to absolute power. His first move? Secure the muscle. You see, Iran basically has 2 militaries, the regular National Army, and then there's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Now, the IRGC was specifically created to be the ideological guardians of the revolution. Khamenei took the IRGC and massively expanded its power, hand-picking its commanders to make sure they were completely loyal to him, creating this incredibly powerful force designed to crush any threat from within.
But here's where it gets interesting. His control wasn't always just about brute force. In 1997, a reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, was elected. His whole platform was about more freedom, more expression. And surprisingly, Khamenei, he let it happen. For a little while anyway. This reform era created this brief window of political and social opening in Iran.
But, and this is a big but, whenever these movements for change seemed to get too big, too powerful, the hammer came down, hard. You can see a clear pattern all through his rule. 1999, student protests, crushed. 2009, the huge green movement protesting a stolen election, mass arrests. And of course, in 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini while in the custody of the morality police, a force that reports right to Khamenei, sparked the biggest protests in Iran's history. And each and every time, Khamenei clamped down and reasserted hardline control.
Now, outside of Iran, Khamenei was playing a much longer, more complicated game. He used this whole network of proxy groups to project Iranian power all across the Middle East and to challenge his 2 great enemies, Israel and the United States.
Khamenei's core strategy, really, was to wage war without ever actually declaring war. So instead of a direct fight, he would fund, arm, and train a whole network of proxy forces. In Lebanon, you have the powerful Hezbollah. In Gaza, Hamas, and down in Yemen, the Houthis. These groups allowed Iran to hit its enemies and expand its influence all across the region, from the Mediterranean all the way to the Red Sea. But the ultimate piece on this grand chessboard has always been the nuclear program. He inherited it from the Shah, but Khamenei put his foot on the gas. Now, Iran has always said its program is peaceful, but the rest of the world wasn't so sure, and it brought crippling sanctions down on the country. The 2015 nuclear deal, that offered a little bit of a break, but when the US pulled out in 2018, it put Iran and the West right back on a collision course.
So, after more than 3 decades of this strategy, of building this axis of resistance and toughing it out through sanctions, where does Khamenei's big project stand today? Well, if you look at what's happened recently, it suggests his entire life's work might be on the verge of total collapse.
I mean, just think about the contrast. A short while ago, Iran's network of proxies looked unstoppable. But in a stunningly short amount of time, devastating military strikes by Israel and the US have crippled Hamas, battered Hezbollah, and hammered the Houthis. This whole strategy of using proxies as a shield, it's been shattered. It's revealed the regime to be what some analysts are now calling a paper tiger. And that weakness on the outside is so dangerous because it reflects a deep fragility on the inside, with a broken economy and a population that's had enough.
And here's the reality. Ali Khamenei is in his 80s. He's ruled Iran longer than the Shah ever did. His entire reign has been one massive, high-stakes gamble, sacrificing his own people's prosperity and their freedom, all for the sake of regional power. And with that project now falling apart, the biggest question of all remains: what happens when he's gone? And what will be the final legacy of the man who survived an assassin's bomb to rule a nation